Am I on? It's karaoke time. No, I promise I won't. Good afternoon, everyone. This is the long, dark tea time of the afternoon. If you're feeling sleepy, I hope you had some caffeine. I'm Dave Holland. I'm from the Wellcome Sanger Institute. I'm going to talk to you about moving a live Ceph cluster without dropping anything. I was looking for a title for the talk, and this was a close second, so you can maybe vote later. So this is the Sanger Institute. We are based south of Cambridge in Hingston. The Institute was founded about 30 years ago in the 1990s as part of the Human Genome Project. That was to sequence a human genome, i.e. to produce the 3 billion base pairs, that's the letters A, C, G, or T, which make up the code for what makes you, you, or me, me. That project took just over 10 years. Bear that number in mind. I'll come back to it later. So DNA sequencing, really, really quickly. You take your sample, which might be animal or vegetable, you squish it, whether chemically, mechanically, physically, and there are then two main methods. You either apply a fluorescent dye to the fragments, and you put them through a gel in an electric field. That's on the left. The different size fragments move a different distance. Then you shine a laser on it, you get a different color spot out, depending whether it's A, C, G, or T. Simple. The more modern approach is you unzip the DNA, because it's a double helix, you get one side of it out, and you poke it through a nanopore, a very small hole, and you place a voltage across the nanopore, and depending what current comes out, you can tell, again, A, C, G, or T. There you go. Now you're all DNA sequencing experts. DNA sequences come in different sizes. I'd say humans are 3 billion base pairs. You can think about that being 3 billion bytes if you take the simple-minded approach. But when you're sequencing, you're not just interested in one copy because there are variations. I'm me and you're you. These are all different. And even within other species where you might not be able to tell the difference between, say, this dandelion and that dandelion, there are still many, many differences, and you might have to sequence maybe 30, 50, 100 times to see all those differences. So we can't just think of the simple data size. We have to think of multiples of the data size. So that's the data. Why Ceph? Well, it's obvious. We've got all this data. We need to put it somewhere. We have an OpenStack private cloud, as well as a bunch of HPC clusters. We deployed OpenStack about 8 years ago to give the informatics staff lots of flexibility. They wanted root. They couldn't have root on HPC clusters. We gave them OpenStack. They got root. They were really happy, with a bunch of constraints around network access and things like that. So the Ceph was supposed to support that. If you know OpenStack, then you know there's Cinder, there's Glance, there's all these other things that need block devices underneath. We also put S3, the Rados gateway, on there just as an afterthought almost. We thought, this might be handy. Fast forward, you won't be surprised to see, oh look, the users love S3. Scientists love a POSIX file system, but if they can't have a POSIX file system, then S3 is the next best thing. Lots of tools will talk to S3, so it's a really good thing. Slightly superficial chart on the right. We thought we'd be doing OpenStack Ceph. Actually, it turns out S3 is the killer app for our Ceph. So here's some headline numbers. 15 petabytes raw. We're doing 3-way replication. That was a deliberate choice because we used cheap, in inverted commas, hardware. It's Supermicro, it's commodity. When it works, it's wonderful. When it doesn't work, it's a pain. So you want something that a reliable protocol off the top. 3-way replication covers that really nicely. We're looking at over 3,000 OSDs. That is quite large in terms of Ceph clusters, and as I understand it from looking at the public telemetry. We have made it internet-facing with a Rails gateway. We've got HA proxy in there. It's all fairly resilient, and slightly embarrassingly, we are still on version 16 Pacific. Again, I'll come back to that later. Here it is in situ. We did not pay extra for curvy racks. That's a lovely fisheye view. And this is the cluster intertwined with OpenStack because of the way it was deployed. That's before we started this move. So what we were trying to do, in the previous picture, you saw what were high power cabinets, and I'll talk about the power requirements shortly. But basically, our data center staff said, please, can you get some kit out of those cabinets? We need them for other things. Okay, we'll do that. There was a lifecycle requirement as well. Some of these machines are, or were, quite old, dating back to 2017. I'll talk about that a bit more, but keeping them on support was becoming a bit expensive. And of course, the obvious requirement, keep stuff working. So here's another view from the data center. Our data center staff have this lovely asset tracking scheme where you can do fly-throughs, you can do 3D views. This is looking down on top of that row with the Ceph and OpenStack in it. One of the previous slides, I think, mentioned failure domains. There's a little overlay there showing you where the 4 different failure domains are. And we decided we can safely move 2 of these into other data center rooms. We have 4 data center rooms in our data center on site. The blue one is slightly smaller because they're not all equally sized, but let's not go into that. So thinking about power, the racks that we looked at were, quote, high power racks, 30 kilowatts, burstable to 4 kilowatts. That's quite a lot. We used them because at the time they were the only racks available in that suite, but they are, well, given that a full rack of Ceph only uses 9 kilowatts, they are slight overkill. We are recently getting very much into GPUs, so there was a requirement, please can you shift these Ceph machines so we can put some ridiculous high-power GPU servers in there. As it turns out, the other rooms are typically 10 kilowatt racks, perfect size, so we can move that. There's also a more of a sustainability approach as well. If you are cooling things that are not using the full capability of the rack, then you're effectively wasting cooling capability. We were, spending is the wrong word, spending 30% of our cooling budget on these cabs on stuff which we didn't need to spend. So that was another good reason for moving. In terms of lifecycle, I mentioned the original Ceph servers came from 2017. Keeping them on support, yeah, not brilliant because they're getting old. It says the 6 terabyte disks are small. That was another incentive, but actually buying 6 terabyte disks is becoming increasingly difficult. So we have not quite a cupboard full, a shelf full, I'll say, but it's getting harder and harder to replace them at sensible prices. And also, unsurprisingly, you can think about a bathtub curve. As machines get older, they tend to fail more. In terms of availability, our Ceph is kind of mission critical to us. We started thinking, yeah, it'll be for research storage. There's not really an SLA as such on the research platform. Turns out that people like dataset hosting that's reliable and accessible. Turns out they share their data with all their friends. And if you've turned on internet access, then they share it with all their off-site friends as well. Before you know it, you're running a mission-critical service. In my last talk at one of these days, I mentioned how, without us realizing, this S3 service was used to transfer COVID sequencing data to the UK government. I was surprised when I found that out. It's amazing what mission creep happens. So looking at this, we thought, okay, there's going to be some pain in this. None of these things is easy. What's going to happen? So there's a few points here which I'll talk through in turn. For, let's say, historical reasons, we are still using Ceph Ansible. On the plus side, it works. On the downside, let's read the rest of the slide. It's basically abandoned. There appear to be no people that are interested in maintaining it, which is a bit sad because, as I say, it works on the whole. It is quite complicated. I mean, Ansible itself is quite complicated. We didn't help ourselves here. We've got a dynamic inventory, which always makes things a little bit exciting. And we found it's very, very slow. I think someone else mentioned that earlier on today. One of my colleagues spent several months trying to make it faster and just gave up in frustration at the end. He seems to spend a lot of time gathering facts when it doesn't need to, things like that. So we thought this would be a problem, and indeed it did turn out to be. I've already mentioned the age of the hardware. Sneak preview, yes, we did see some more failures as expected. Actually getting a bit ahead of myself here, but the disk failure rate increased by about a factor of 3 with the machines that were moved. We also saw things we didn't expect, that's CPU and memory failures. It turns out that moving old machines is probably not a good idea. Networking was something we didn't really think about until after we started working out where the machines were going to go in the other rooms. Then we thought, hang on, wait a minute. We've deployed this lot into basically a single layer 2, a single subnet. We don't really want to stretch the subnet across data center rooms. It's not really good practice. Our data center network expert basically said, no, you're not going to do that. Fortunately, because this was in the same bed as OpenStack, we had VXLAN configured on the switches already. VXLAN, in case you haven't met it already, it's a tunneling protocol. It means you can stretch a VLAN between different routed domains. We're using it for hypervisor networks. It's a logical next step to use that for Ceph networks as well. So we were able to use the same VLAN with the same IP addresses and the same host names for machines that we moved. It was as if they were plugged into the same place, but we'd moved them 50 meters over there. Ceph never knew a thing. We did change the host names for the IPMI interfaces, the BMCs. because they didn't have VXLAN available to those switches. But that's okay. It just meant we had host names with an A on the end, and we had to rename everything, rename it back again at the end of the process. But having VXLAN for this sort of migration is probably the biggest win we found along the way. Another thing which could be a positive if you look at it in one way, but actually I think was a negative on balance. We took a long time over this. We took about 4 or 5 months. It was a low priority project. It was, the only benefit was to the data center team in letting them put equipment where they wanted to. There was no obvious benefit to us in the HPC team. So it definitely sat at the bottom of the list. As a result, we occasionally said, hang on, we should do a bit more of this. Where have we got to? Which machines have we moved? There was a certain amount of record keeping that was maybe not as good as it could have been. And as an institute, we have a change freeze over Christmas. The institute technically shuts down. Actually, it doesn't. The scientists keep working, so otherwise we could have done this in the change freeze. We had to keep the system up all the way through, but we just couldn't move anything. So we did it. What went well and what didn't. So moving a Ceph machine against the backdrop of VXLAN where it doesn't actually know it's moved is really, really easy. You set the no out, you set the no rebalance, you move the machine. That's it. Because Ceph isn't trying to move any data, nothing happens. It's like magic. In terms of the actual physical movement, I love my data center colleagues. They're wonderful. I won't say a word against them, but occasionally we did have a little bit of confusion. Have you plugged the 1 gig management into the IPMI port? I think you have, yes. We had this in the past, so our Ceph startup scripts actually do a sanity check. Is the 1 gig interface up, alive, pingable, routing packets? If not, don't even think about starting the OSDs. We had some physical effects as well. So it turns out that some of the hypervisors, because this OpenStack and Ceph is intermingled, it turns out some nearby hypervisors were not quite latched into the rack properly. They got joggled slightly when the Ceph machines moved, and we did lose power to some hypervisors. Oops. Yep, hands up for that. Couldn't do much about it, but we noticed it. We did also find that power leads without latches, maybe not the best purchase ever. I said this is commodity hardware. Even before we'd started moving things, we found some power leads were loose because we did an audit of what's connected where. If you can buy equipment with latching power leads, I'd say it's definitely worth the money. It will save you from some, oops, why did that go off? In terms of rebuilds or new machines, we didn't do the upmap, we didn't do the reweighting, we didn't do any of the clever stuff. We did the very, very simple, stupid approach. We knew the data was going to have to move onto the new machine, so we said, okay, we'll just take the rebalance hit. We'll move the data onto the new machine. Like it says, shut down the old machine, install the new one, let the rebuild happen. We experimented with some recovery throttles. The box there is as high as we dared turn it. Most of the time we had the max backfill set to 1 and the max active set to 4, I think, which was absolutely fine. Didn't upset any client traffic at all. Because a recovery or a rebuild is a long tail process, we did turn it up towards the end. So there was some operator intervention, kind of tweaking it. Maybe it would be nice if there was an automatic way for Ceph to do this. It's pretty much an optimization of the process, so I wouldn't lose any sleep over it. But having said that, we moved a lot of data in this process. That might have been something that contributed to failures of the hard disks of these older machines. As a side effect, as I say, we weren't buying 6 terabyte disks anymore, we bought 18 terabyte disks. So we've installed machines with 60 18 terabyte disks, having taken out machines with 66 terabyte machines. We got a free bonus capacity upgrade. That's great. This means that we might actually be able to turn off some machines in the longer term, which, again, from a power consumption and sustainability point of view, is potentially a bonus. When we were doing this process, we were watching the graphs like hawks, should we say. I should say that the granularity of the top graph is a daily point. So if we're seeing, in some places it looks like we had degraded or misplaced for more than a day. It's not entirely true. That's averaging from graphite and Grafana for you. But on the right-hand side, that's when we did do a bunch of moves, possibly too many at once, and we did see multiple days of Ceph being not in health OK status, and I'll talk about that again in a sec. If health is not in health OK status, what happens to the MON database? It doesn't get trimmed. If it doesn't get trimmed, it grows. Oh, that's quite a big MON database. I wonder if anyone else has ever seen a MON database maybe that big. We hadn't. That's a new high score for us. Another thing that we found was the new SCSI controllers, despite not being specified as RAID controllers, actually did multipath. So when we started installing it, hang on, no, we do not have 120 hard disks. What is going on here? Ceph Ansible needed patching for that because it simple-mindedly had no idea what was going on. We had to write some extra multipath scripts. We've got some local scripts for our data center staff to manage OSD replacements. They needed updating as well. I mean, multipath is a thing. We got it for free. Maybe that's a bonus, but it was something that we had not expected at the start of this process. We did make one mistake in the purchasing. As well as NVMEs for the WIL partition, we do use some NVMEs for OSDs, for pools that need lots of high IOs, like the Rados Gateway metadata pool. We forgot to order those. That was an oops. We had to go scavenging from the old machines. This sounds a little bit scary, but we are logging and monitoring the wear of these NVMEs. They're all still in the 90%, to be honest, so we are not scared about having scavenged these old NVMEs. It's fine. Something that I predicted but didn't predict quite how far out it would get is the deep scrub schedule. We've already set the interval up to 28 days because we have so many OSDs. Because of the throttling and the backfilling and the not health okay, we got a long way behind that schedule. And that was without even turning off the no deep scrub to speed up the recovery. Thousands and thousands and thousands of placement groups got delayed beyond their 28 days. So with a little bit of a nasty command line such as that, you can find out what are the oldest, you can prioritize deep scrubbing those, and that was a bit of a, not quite a daily job. Every couple of days, see what the backlog looks like, fire those off, go away. A couple of days later, again, check the backlog, fire them off, see how it looks. And we got the spread back okay. It took about 3 weeks, I seem to remember, but everything is back within that 28-day window now. So was it a success? Yes, I can tick all the boxes. We moved all of the machines successfully. We've placed the oldest machines, yep, and we kept the cluster up throughout, so everybody is happy, pretty much. If we try and put some numbers on that, we do availability monitoring. We've got an end-to-end test that uses our S3 service. It puts an object, lists it, gets it back again, checks the checksum, did everything succeed, fantastic. And it turns out that actually the things that happened in there were not from relocation processes that we were doing. It was all from something else, and it's an interesting highlight. The one thing that actually did cause a dent is from a failing or a slow hard disk. It turns out if you buy cheap commodity hardware, it doesn't handle failing disks very well. It's not like a NetApp or something, or an IBM system that will say, oh, that disk looks a bit funny, put it in Disk Hospital, whatever. No, these are just boring commodity Linux boxes, and they just go a bit slow, and Ceph doesn't like that. But it doesn't actually notice enough to evict the OSD. So again, that's something that maybe a more recent version of Ceph would help us with. So thinking about the future, yes, we need to get off Ceph Ansible. If there's anyone who's got it recently, I'm interested to know. In tandem with that, yes, we need to upgrade. I gather that more recent versions of the orchestrator are more reliable at adopting an existing cluster. So again, very interested to know if people have got recommendations for that as well. And as I said before, we got a free bonus capacity upgrade out of this. We can think about retiring some of these machines, possibly in preference to replacing other machines, although I think the not original machines are from about 2019, so these assets are definitely being sweated. There's only so far we can push this. But that's it. Everyone was happy. Any questions? I'll take the stunned silence as no. Thank you.